Well, today we're going to discuss fascism, and I'm going to be talking about it primarily as a political ideology, one that arose seemingly out of nothing, though as we'll see that's not quite true, in the 20th century, ended up having a huge role to play in shaping the 1930s and the 1940s especially, but the ideas behind it are far from dead. And as a political movement, it now goes by other names. It got a very, very bad reputation. Nevertheless, I think you'll see that it has some similarities with other views we've already talked about. The person who is really the philosopher, you might say, behind the ideology of fascism is Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was a socialist journal. He edited something called The Future of the Worker, who became the leader of the Italian Socialist Party. He took over the government of Italy in 1922 after a march on Rome. Remember, Italy entered the First World War late. It was sort of auctioning off its services to either side. It was willing to fight on the side of the Allies, it was willing to fight on the German side. In the end, actually joined up with the Allies and ended up fighting a number of battles against Austria-Hungary, wars that took place in northern Italy that were really inconclusive, I should say battles, but battles that also consumed large numbers of lives on both sides. It became obvious to the Italians that they were not a first-rate power. And so Mussolini, in part, was able to take power as a result of economic turmoil at the end of the war, in part this perception of Italian weakness that he promised to correct. He did this in a coup d'etat. He was not democratically elected. He and his followers simply marched on Rome after an election they thought they should have won and demanded power. In 1924, he did win an election, though it's widely thought that he got it through violence and intimidation rather than winning it legitimately. And in 1925, he declared himself Il Duce, the leader. He dismantled all restraints on his own power and so turned Italy from a representative democracy into something like a totalitarian state. Now, he started out as a Marxist. His parents were socialists who were strongly attracted to anarchism. He was himself deeply influenced by Marx and Nietzsche. He read a lot of Marx as a young man and considered himself a Marxist. He thought Marx was the father and teacher, the magnificent philosopher of working-class violence. Nevertheless, he found himself quickly out of step with at least mainstream orthodox Marxism, and so ended up in his thought over the next few years diverging more and more from Marxism. He was influenced greatly by Georges Sorel, a Marxist thinker who called himself a revolutionary syndicalist. Anyway, he wrote a book. He's really famous. He wrote 10 books, but he's famous for one book called Reflections on Violence, which was published in 1908. He argued for two things. One was the virtue of violence itself. He thought violence as something that was an essential part of social reform, but also he argued in favor of the power of social myths. He thought that people react not, as Marx said, on the basis of material and economic forces, but rather on the basis of ideas. And they were hugely shaped by ideas, by ideals, by things that inspired them. People aren't inspired by jobs and pay scales and things like that. They are inspired by overall things that they think are true. He said they don't have to be true, people just have to think they're true. People have to adopt them and be motivated by them. Now, Mussolini, I've said, began to diverge from Marxism. One of the ways in which he diverged was influenced in part by Sorel and in part by Lenin, this belief in a revolutionary elite. He came to see that, yes, the Marxist revolution was not going to occur on its own. The proletarians just wanted better working conditions, better pay, and so on. They didn't really want to overthrow the existing order of society, so it wasn't going to happen on its own. The second big step away from Marxism was his rejection of materialism and economic determinism. This, too, was inspired by Sorel. He thought that, yes, ideas, myths, things like that play a large role in human affairs. It isn't just a matter of people acting in reaction to social forces. It's not just a matter of economics, not just a matter of historical determinism. In fact, insofar as you believe in the role of a revolutionary elite, you're really going to believe that the power of human will is significant, but if that's true, then no kind of determinism can be right, and in particular, economic determinism can't be right. And then finally, he rejects the idea of class struggle and replaces it with the idea of something else. He still accepts that much of history has consisted of class struggle, but he comes up with a different solution. So, let's take a look at the first part. You can see this reminds you a lot of Lenin. He wrote of vanguard minorities, small, trained, dedicated elite forces who were going to raise the consciousness of the proletariat. He thought that violence would be an essential part of this. And in fact, Mussolini favored not quite the kind of violent revolution Lenin did, but things like organized strikes with the possibility of violence. He wanted things that were social movements that had a violent edge, even though it wasn't simply a violent revolution. He wanted to prepare, however, the proletariat for the greatest bloodbath of all, and seemed to think that if you did that in the right sort of way, the bloodbath actually wouldn't be necessary. Nevertheless, people should be prepared for it, because it might take real violence to conduct the revolution in the way that he wanted. So in this respect, you can see he had a lot of similarities to Lenin. He too was opposed to reform, opposed to democracy. He believed in a party which was highly centralized, hierarchical, disciplined. He thought, yes, the proletariat won't organize itself, that's why this elite is so necessary. It had to consist of a leadership of professional revolutionaries. And indeed, he thought they could bring about revolutionary consciousness. Now here's a place where he's stressing ideas. He's saying we can get people to think in different terms. And if they think in different terms, they adopt different social myths, that will lead them to act very differently. In the end, he said organized violence would win out. So in all these respects, he's something familiar, right? He looks like a Leninist. And so there is a sense in which both of them really are sort of Marx plus Nietzsche, a basic Marxist analysis, but then adding this idea of the will to power, of an individual who can rise above the pack and do something dramatically different. Now, it doesn't stay at that level, however. What happened is that Lenin seized power in Russia, and Mussolini saw what the Russian Revolution actually brought about. We've talked about the Russian Revolution and gotten sort of up to this point, but we didn't really look at what happened afterwards. The answer was, over the next several years, mass starvation and a mass deindustrialization. Here are starving and homeless peasants in Russia after the revolution. Mussolini was tuned in enough to be aware of what was happening and to realize that there was something fundamentally wrong with Lenin's version of Marxism. Now, he wasn't himself bothered by the first step that began to bother the Western powers, the murder of the royal family on July 16, 1918. There was also the murder of British naval attaché. This infuriated the British and other people in the West. Churchill urged that Lenin and Trotsky be captured and shot. But the Western powers were really unwilling to do this. They were tired of the war. They didn't want to engage in a further aspect of the war and attack someone who had been an ally during the First World War, so they did nothing. Now there's another thing that began to happen and that Mussolini observed. Lenin really replaced one ruling class with another. This is a Yugoslavian, well, now I guess you'd say Serbian, theorist, Milovan Djilas. He wrote about the new class, and he said what tends to rise to power in a communist society is a new class. A class that isn't really the old bourgeoisie, but isn't the proletariat either. Consists basically of the bureaucrats, the party functionaries, intellectuals in some cases, the people who are going to decide what actually happens. After all, in this kind of socialist society, you aren't going to have market forces determining things, but somebody has to determine things. Somebody has to run these government-run enterprises. And so think about the various forms of the means of production that get taken over in this kind of revolution. I mean, what do you have? What kinds of institutions are now going to have to be run by the government?
Steel mills.
Steel mills, right. And so you're going to have government workers who run steel mills. Well, who's going to do that? You don't want them to be the nasty old bourgeoisie. In fact, you sort of, by this point, think you've killed them. And so who's left? Well, there are going to have to be people who run this. Somebody's going to have to make the decisions about who works when and how much steel is produced and who orders what and so on. And so there's going to have to be somebody in charge of something. That's going to be this new class. Now, you might say, Djilas was the first to realize there was going to be a major theme in politics throughout the 20th century, which was the extent to which we ought to be ruled by this new class, the elites, versus ruled by the people. To what extent you can trust democracies to make decisions themselves, and to what extent you want to substitute for democratic decisions the rule by elites, rule by this new class. Now, it's by no means just a class that ends up being significant in socialist societies. As governments have grown all over the world, this new class of government workers, professors, bureaucrats, people who work for non-governmental organizations, non-profits, and so on, this elite takes over more and more institutions, becomes more and more powerful. And so the extent to which they ought to rule becomes a significant issue. In fact, Robert Michaels, writing in 1911, just before this, observed the iron law of oligarchy. All forms of organization eventually turn into oligarchies. Who says organization, he wrote, says oligarchy. Meaning, in other words, anytime you have an organization dedicated to anything, some people have to organize it. Some people have to rise to the top and direct it. And so those people are going to constitute this oligarchy, this small ruling class that actually, in practice, makes the decisions. Yeah?
For those of us that don't know, what is an oligarchy?
Good. An oligarchy is a rule by a few. Okay, democracy is rule by the people. A totalitarian form of government is ruled by one person. An oligarchy is ruled by a certain subset. Ruled by a few is really what it means in the Greek. And so the idea is that whenever you have an organization, some people end up running it. To put it in a way that is more familiar to a lot of people who don't think of themselves as ruling anything, a few people end up doing all the work. In fact, that's the way I've sometimes heard this. 90% or 10% of the people do 90% of the work. And that's probably true, but also that means 10% of the people are making 90% of the decisions. And so, in the end, really anytime you organize anything, a few people end up being in positions of power. And it doesn't matter, in other words, whether they're the owners of the means of production, or the agents of the state, or whatever it is, still a few people are going to be making most of the decisions. That's the theory, at any rate. Now, under Lenin, the new class grew to maybe 15 million people, but he was careful to maintain control himself and by a very small elite that he handpicked. So, to some extent, yes, all these were functionaries, but he tried to keep everybody under the control of the party and under control of the ruling elite of the party, especially himself. Now, remarkably enough, when all this was going on in Russia, the Western press reports were glowing. Lincoln Steffens in 1919 famously visited the Soviet Union and said, "I've been over into the future and it works." Okay, all roads in our day, he wrote, lead to Moscow. So he and many other people in the United States and other Western countries thought of the experiment of the Soviet Union as this exciting thing that so far was working out well. But Mussolini was close enough to realize that wasn't true at all. In fact, in Petrograd, which was the new name given to St. Petersburg, between 1917 and 1920, in just 3 years, 72% of the population simply disappeared. Either died or fled into the countryside. 3 million people died of starvation in the winter of 1921 to 22. In 1920, compared to the situation before the war, iron production in Russia was only 2% of what it had been. Manufactured goods in general, only 13%. In short, the Russian economy basically shut down. Yes?
Why was, if this was all true, then why is there such an illusion that the Russian is working?
Why was there such an illusion? Okay, good. Suppose you're in Russia at the time. Things are falling apart. There's almost no manufacturing. There's almost no industry. Agriculture is in total chaos. There's very little food production. There is famine. People are starving in the cities and fleeing into the countryside in search of food. Now you've got these Western visitors. What do you do to convince them this is all going great? Yeah.
Same thing a lot of communist powers do today. You lead them on a tour.
You take them on a tour. Exactly right. You say, comrade, there are still vestiges of the revolution. It's very dangerous. But we will give you a tour of some sample villages so you can see what life is like. And then you actually have what were called Potemkin villages. These model villages where you take visitors. And you show them how beautiful it is. And there, indeed, everything's very nice, right? And then you say, and come see what we're building. And we're building a new dam. And you see the big new dam. And people say, whoa, you're building this. Now, they go home and they write wonderful things in their newspapers and so forth. But suppose, I want you to imagine right now that you are governor of Texas. And you are going to try to convince people from a faraway land that Texas is just like Star Trek. Okay, it's like that kind of futuristic world where we just go over to machines and we punch in what we want and it fabricates it for us and so on. It's just like being on the Enterprise. Do you think you could do it?
Yeah, you go to NASA.
Well, that's true. You go to NASA, it's really pretty easy. That's true. Well, it could be that we're in Texas. But it's not just that luck of the draw.
It depends on how investigative they are. If they're just looking for a quick story, then you could certainly lead them on a tour. But they have freedom of movement here, and they don't necessarily have that if they're going over to Russia.
Okay, good. There was no freedom of movement in Russia, so you can control exactly where they go and what they see and who they talk to. So they talk to engineers who are talking about all of these exciting projects. Maybe they exist, maybe they don't, right? You show them this village where all the people seem fat and happy. Then you show them this big new industrial project that you're starting. Who knows whether it'll ever finish, but at least you're starting it, right? And so, in short, you can show them pretty much anything you want. Now, if they can go around and talk to anybody and travel anywhere, they're going to uncover this. And journalists in some places were doing that. There were reports in some parts of the European press, for example. And actually, we'll see later, Chicago newspapers were much better than New York newspapers at covering all of this. But there were photographs like this being taken of starvation in the Soviet Union at the time, and those weren't being reported in the United States hardly at all. So people were able to successfully pull the wool over these journalists' eyes. Now, Mussolini, as I say, was close enough to see all of this, and he adapted. He said there's something more that's wrong with Marxism than anything that Lenin uncovered. After all, Leninism has been put into practice here, and it's a disaster, a human fiasco. So, he thought something more fundamental had to go. He rejected the idea of the class struggle, and in particular, the Marxist solution to class struggle. He said, look, what we should do is not destroy the class that actually knew how to run things. Why did he diagnose Leninism as having destroyed Russia? He said, you just killed everybody who actually knew how anything worked. The people who knew how to grow the food, the people who knew how to get the food to market, the people who knew how to actually make the factories run, you just killed them all. And so now what do? Nobody knows how to work anything. So he said, that's not the solution. The solution is not to destroy the bourgeoisie. What we have to do instead is to get all the classes working for a common goal, for some common good. So he stresses unity, stresses going beyond politics, and says we have to get everybody pulling in the same direction, working for the same goal. So that, he says, is really what we have to do. He rejects historical materialism, he says. That can't be right, we can't explain everything about human affairs in terms of just the means of production. He also says, look, there are lots of economic things that are relevant, but to explain all of human history with that is absurd. Fascism believes now and always in sanctity and heroism. That is to say, in acts which have no economic motive. And so his idea is really, look, economics isn't enough. There's more going on than that. Moreover, all this talk of class struggle, that's not the right way to do it. That isn't the primary agent in social transformations. We've got to do something else. Here's a simple way of looking at it in a diagram. Marx divides everything into bourgeoisie and proletariat and says, here's how we eliminate class struggle. We eliminate the bourgeoisie. Mussolini says if you do that, you will face disaster. So what you have to do is create some larger whole that includes them and all the other classes, that they all can work toward, and that's the state. Now, that becomes his solution then. To put it in a slogan, everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Okay, so the state is to comprise everything. Everything becomes part of the state. Now, what does that mean? What are some of the things that exist in our society, for example, outside the state, and would be put under the heading of the state by Mussolini's slogan?
Literature?
Well, literature, yeah. We ordinarily think, look, creative arts of all kinds, literature, music, art, that's done on the side, right? That's things people do themselves or do in groups. It's not something done by the government, through the government.
The state would be religion under this model, right?
Ah, good. Religion is usually outside the state. Here there would either be no religion or religion has to become part of the state. You might imagine that Mussolini had interesting relations with the Vatican, and there's a whole history to be explained there of the attempts at treaties to get peace between the Italian government and the Vatican. But in a largely Catholic country, the church turned out to be a crucial element of this. What else?
Private businesses?
Private businesses, yes. Mussolini, as we'll see, bragged a few years into this that he had taken over 3/4 of Italian businesses and turned them into agents of the state. And so there are lots of things that become elements of a society that are ordinarily apart from government and that he wants to include within it. Yes?
Interpersonal relationships?
Interpersonal relationships, yes. Ordinarily, we think that's not a matter for the state to decide, right? You fall in love, you marry someone, you have children or don't have children, blah, blah, blah. We ordinarily think that's outside of state purview. But here, nothing's outside, right? Everything is really a political act. Everything is something that is at least potentially subject to the state's control and interference. Now, what do we call this movement? Marxists labeled fascism a movement of the right. Okay, and still, most people, if asked, will say, oh yes, fascism is a right-wing movement. But it's right only relative to Lenin. That is to say, yes, Mussolini was clearly to the right of Lenin. But it's still a movement of the far left in various ways. It's a sort of minor variation on Leninist themes. It's not quite a version of Marxism because he does reject the class struggle analysis and economic determinism. It's not quite Lenin, therefore, but it's still very similar to that in its orientation. Let's look at a couple of ways of trying to characterize political ideologies. Here's a very simple political spectrum. Just one dimension, degree of government control. What would be on the far end of that? Well, anarchy, right? Who says government shouldn't control anything? The other extent, well, some form of totalitarianism that says government should control everything.
What if instead of trying to fit it into one axis, you have two axes, social and economic?
Good. In a moment, I'll show you even three. But yeah, almost certainly this is too simple, right? Because actually there are a number of different dimensions. There are social considerations. There are economic considerations. There's a question of military strength or weakness, aggressive attitudes in foreign affairs or relatively pacifist attitudes, and so on. And so to put things on one dimension is too simple. On the other hand, if we're to think in terms of right and left, as a very first rough approximation, we could say, well, okay, just degrees of control, it looks like anarchy would be at one extreme and totalitarianism at another. Marxism, and Leninism in particular, are saying, yes, everything should be under control and so on. It is very close to that totalitarian ideal. Fascism is still very close to that, right? He's saying everything within the state, nothing outside the state. Yeah?
Well, when I learned this originally in high school, we learned it as more of a circle than a line, and that fascism was far right and Marxism was far left.
Yes.
And when you go around the circle, they actually come really close to being the same thing, but they're actually not as distinctly close on that line.
Yes, yes, this is good. I'm glad you brought that up because this is the analysis that drives me crazy. Okay, but that many people say. They'll say, well, yes, it's not really like this. It's more like a circle because actually the far left is something like Marxism and totalitarianism. The far right is really fascism. And strangely, they meet and this whole thing bends around in a circle. But it's like, well, wait, how does that happen, right? How does it bend around in a circle? That's very odd. What's happening there? And in fact, what makes fascism a right-wing movement at all? Now, yeah.
Well, it has extreme military control. It has everybody working for the state, and it believes in an economic system which doesn't exclude the bourgeois. So, like, I don't know. Like, obviously, you have much more expertise, but superficially, at least, it seems like something that incorporates a lot of very right-wing ideas.
Ah, well, good. Okay, so what you're really pointing out is, wait a minute, we need to think about military strength or weakness separately. We need to think about economic control and social considerations separately. So suppose we do that. Suppose we say, yeah, this is a very rough approximation, and really it's collapsing everything into one sort of dimension. That's not the right picture, so let's try this picture. And unfortunately, I wasted a lot of time trying to get this to look awesome on a black background, and then I forgot to upload the file with the black background. So this is not quite going to do what I wanted to do. With the black background, the things that are in warm colors jump out at you. And the things in the cool colors recede, and you actually get this three-dimensional feeling. Against the white background, well, it's a little, it's not as good. So anyway, this is meant to be a three-dimensional thing. The up-down axis is sort of a belief in military strength as opposed to pacifism, okay? This is an economic dimension, government control of the economy versus free market. Here we've got social factors, the government control of society as opposed to little control of society, a belief in social freedom. And now I've tried to put various ideologies on this, okay? So fascism, yes, certainly a strong belief in military strength, a strong belief in government control of the economy. They don't wipe out the bourgeoisie, but on the other hand, they want nothing outside the state. And so there is supposed to be at least a close cooperation between big business and government. And so it's not quite as far left as communism is, but nevertheless similar in economic control. With respect to social control, well, again, nothing outside the state. So actually it's meant to be jumping out at you pretty far out here in government control. Yes?
Would a fascist accept this analysis? Because, like, if you said government control of economy, doesn't that imply in some way that the economy is separate to begin with?
No, well, no, I don't mean that to include any separation. That is to say, I don't mean to say government control of then something else. There are various forms this control will take. And so what I'm going to give you in a moment is an attempt at some definitions. if you look up fascism and try to see how is it actually defined by historians or by political philosophers, you find a mess. There is no agreed upon definition. And in fact, often people will list many criteria. They will list 8, 10, 12 criteria for being a fascist and so on. Philosophers hate that. Philosophers don't like big fuzzy concepts that might be associated with this or that or the other thing. We want simple definitions. And so I'm going to try to give you one, but recognizing that nothing I give you is really going to match exactly the way these terms are used, because there isn't really any agreement about the way these terms are used. In fact, I had you look at Orwell's paper on fascism just because he says, look, by my time, that is to say in the late 40s, fascism just means anything I hate. And so he's essentially saying, yeah, in the late 40s, I'm telling you, a fascist is just somebody you don't like, and it has no real meaning beyond that. And so in trying to give it more of a meaning, I'm trying to be faithful to what Mussolini was actually saying. Whether this has much relation to what happens later or not is a subtle question. But anyway, this is an attempt to put different things in different places, and you can see that, well, fascism is about as far from libertarianism on this model as you could possibly get. But then again, this space may itself not be adequate. Maybe you need a lot more than 3 dimensions to try to capture all of this. In any case, here's a first attempt at some definitions. Communism, you might think of as a system of social and economic organization that places key institutions. That's what I'm calling the means of production here, because it's contentious to think of them as just means of production. From a fascist point of view, the key institutions are often the idea-making institutions, not just the economic ones. In any case, places key institutions under government ownership and control. So here, indeed, there's no separation. The idea is the government is simply to take over the economy, and things are to be owned by government. Fascism differs in the following way. It places key institutions under government control, but through indirect means, not through direct ownership, although I should point out that Mussolini did brag that he had brought 3/4 of the Italian economy under the government umbrella, but through means such as regulation, through the selection of directors. In other words, the government picking who is on the boards, who will run the companies. Government, management, labor boards that are set up so that government plays a role in how management runs companies and so on, rather than direct ownership. So the goal here is still, in a sense, to have government controlled, have everything working in the direction the state chooses, but nevertheless not quite in as direct way by directly moving the pieces itself, but by tilting the playing board so that the pieces move, by working with the pieces to make them move in the right way, and so on. Both of these are really forms of socialism. The idea there would be, yes, it places key institutions under government direction toward government-selected ends, but leaves the means open. Fascism is a particular way of saying, let's select these means for influencing how things go toward government-selected ends, and communism is a different way, saying, let's just have government control these directly. The fascist controls them indirectly. There are many other forms of socialism as well, of course. You don't have to be one or the other. You might believe in all sorts of less direct forms of influence than the fascist has. So socialism is meant to be a very broad term that includes these two as options within it. Yeah?
I thought communism is where the workers own the means of production. How does that involve the government?
Ah, right. Good. Yes, workers are to own the means of production, so how does that involve the government? It might or might not. In the sort of version of this that Lenin develops and Stalin continues in Russia, the version that was actually implemented in most countries, the government is taken to represent the workers. After all, how do the workers do this? Okay, the thought is, well, the state does it, and then the workers are supposed to have some influence on the state. The state does it on behalf of the workers. There are versions of communism that are, you might say, micro as opposed to macro versions, where people say, no, I don't mean that. I mean, let's let each company be run by a board of workers that they workers elect. And there it's not government control, it's rather getting rid of this layer of management and let the workers themselves have ownership of the company and that type of thing. And so that version would be a version that would say, wait, I don't mean government ownership. The workers' ownership and control should be the real definition here. And then to say, oh, and the government will do it on behalf of the workers. That's a further step, a step that Lenin and Stalin and a whole bunch of other people took, but nevertheless not something that's really part of the ideology. So actually you're right, this would probably be better put in a way that's faithful to a broader spectrum of communists to say, no, really, the workers' ownership and control, and then this is just a substitute frequently made for practical or other reasons. Yeah, good. Okay, well, I'm going far on a limb here, because basically, as I say, there isn't much organization to the way people use these terms in politics or in history, so we're trying to play some, and by all means, if you've got better suggestions, I am more than happy to hear them, because in trying to figure out how most people do this, it's a mess. In any case, there are some sharp differences that emerge between Mussolini's fascism, anyway, and things that we ordinarily think of as the right, and that he considers the right. Fascism is strictly communitarian. It believes in the primacy of the collective. Whereas his enemy, and it's not only communism, but sort of classical free market principles, is individualistic. There are no limits on power in fascism, everything within the state, whereas the traditional classical liberal sort of conservative view has to do with limits, checks, balances, and all of that. It stresses the rights of government as opposed to the rights of the individual, the freedom of government as opposed to the freedom of the individual. And so, if we look at what Mussolini is concerned to say, he wants to make it clear that individuals don't play an important role. He says no individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes exist outside the state. So nothing is supposed to exist outside the state. He says man is man only by virtue of the spiritual process to which he contributes as a member of the family, the social group, the nation, and the function of history. So the individual has no importance outside the state and outside the society. Outside history, he says man is a non-entity. Fascism opposes all individualistic abstractions based on 18th century materialism. He means, in other words, against Locke and the American founding and all that. It doesn't believe in the possibility of happiness on earth. Okay, so there's no point in worrying about the pursuit of happiness.
How did he take this jump? Because that's what like his entire philosophy is based on, but he really just seems to say it and then it's a fact for him. There's no justification.
Yeah. Okay, good. One of the things that's frustrating in reading this is that indeed he's proclaiming things, right? He's making speeches. He is not actually giving you any kind of argument. And so he's saying, this is what man is. This is what we champion. This is, and there is no argument at all. You're right. So where is he getting this? And does he have any justification for any of it? I mean, it's very convenient, right? It's like, yes, you all have no significance apart from me since I have seized power. And so guess what? You're all important because I'm important. And so I should be in control of everything and you should be in control of nothing. How do you feel about that? You're supposed to be now cheering, saying, yay, you duce, you duce. Yeah.
I guess what I'm going after is like in the journalism class or in pretty much any other class where it's like involved investigating people, there's always like the saying, beware the fallacy of evil men. Like, does he have any kind of belief in this system? Or like, what is he, is this actually coming from something? Like, obviously he's not providing it in speech.
Okay, good. Yes. It is coming from something. I won't go on with these quotations, but it's making the same point. Fascism asserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual and so on. It's the liberty of, yes, if liberalism spells individualism, fascism spells government. And he's speaking here about classical liberalism, i.e. the liberalism of Locke and the American founders and so on. So where is any of this coming from? Well, by now you can probably tell. Actually, this is Hegel again, okay? This is Hegel's idea of politics, yet again. He'll say, the state is like an organism, okay? And you all are just parts of the body. And so that's why, it's that same metaphor. Except, now here's what's really distinctive about his fascist take on it. He's a Darwinist. And so he says, look, yes, the state is an organism, but now tell me about organisms. Tell me about the theory of evolution. What is the role of an organism? What is its goal?
To survive.
To survive and reproduce, exactly. And how does it do that?
Adapt.
By adapting. And how does it adapt to a world full of conflict and danger?
Random.
It evolves.
Well, random mutation, yes. But if you're already there as an organism, what do? How do you
You
survive?
have to be more powerful.
You have to be more powerful, right? Nature, in Darwin's view, is red in tooth and claw, right? Organisms are striving for existence. There are limited resources. You have to fight others to survive. And so he says, so must a people fight to survive. Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about how he says that the state is, like, he completely eliminates this idea of an individual.
Yes.
However, you can't necessarily get away with that in a government for the amount of time that he did. So that's why he created programs like Mother's Day and things like that to reproduce heavy amounts of, like, women were turned into essentially baby manufacturing machines. Like, you just increased the amount of children that you had and you would get special awards from the government. So it kind of made you an individual in the awards that you would get because you were noticed in the eyes of the government. So you were eliminated your identity, but you still had the individuality of becoming the best member of the government.
Right.
You're the best.
Okay, good. Excellent point. So here's what you do. If I come to you and say, you know, yeah, you have no significance apart from me, so give me all the power and control over your life, you're likely to say, well, screw you, right? I mean, this is not very appealing speech. But how can I get you on my side? Well, here's one way in which I can do it. I can make your life better. And so take a look at the program. It included not only sort of propaganda methods, so we'll get to those in a moment, but he advocated rule by the elite. He wanted a national council of experts, experts from labor and business, and a variety of other areas who would get together and decide on social policies and social directions. He fought for an 8-hour workday, minimum wage, the rights of unions, workers' representatives, a retirement age of 55. I would already be over the hill. Okay, national militia, nationalized military industries. So part of it is, look, I'll try to make your life better, okay? And in return, you commit yourself fully to the strength of the state. There was a strong progressive tax on capital to try to take resources away from the bourgeoisie toward the government, and a seizure of church property, hence many of the conflicts with the Vatican. But now in addition to this, there were other initiatives. He had a Gold for the Fatherland initiative. He encouraged people to donate jewelry to the state. His own wife donated her wedding rings to the state. Okay, these were melted down and put into gold bars for the national treasury. The government took control of 3/4 of Italian businesses. It imposed wage and price controls. There were other initiatives too. There was a battle for wheat, sometimes translated as the battle for grain. He established new agricultural communities to grow wheat so that Italy could be more self-sufficient in agricultural terms. In some ways that succeeded. Wheat production rose. On the other hand, much of the land, some of which he reclaimed by draining the Pontine marshes and so on, was really better suited to other crops, and eventually they moved beyond wheat. Partly because of that mismatch, food prices continued to rise, and the government had to spend a huge amount of money doing this. But there was also a battle for land, land reclamation and distribution. Notice the redistribution part. Actually, relatively few people were involved in this. Fewer than 10,000 peasants got resettled. Poverty remained high. But this became a program that said, here's what we're doing. We're reshaping the land of Italy. We're reshaping farming and agricultural production. We are going to reshape the social structure. We are going to reward women for having children. We're going to do all, there were these special honors given to people who grew the most wheat, to the mothers who had the most children, and so on and so forth. And so all of this was a way of trying to create these social myths to get people working toward the goals of the state. There was a big propaganda element to this. He promoted fascism as the wave of the future. You see many images of him in poses like this, giving speeches. All teachers had to swear a loyalty oath not just to Italy, but to fascism. All editors of all publications were appointed by Mussolini. So he claimed that there was a free press, but in fact you would get your job or lose your job, depending upon your expression of support for Mussolini. And he built up this cult of personality around himself, so that he was the great man, he was the leader, he was the one who somehow had all the answers. And I should say an important part of this was that he was giving you a third way. This was not to be the cruelty of capitalism, and it was not to be the sort of obvious failure of communism, pointing to Russia. No, no, no. This was to be some other way, a new way that he had discovered, and to which he had the key. And so here are some images of him put out in the press. Here he is in his military uniform making a speech. Here he is in front of a crowd of many, many thousands. And you can see, not only in his uniform, his manner, but the setting of this, he knew how to stage things. And as we'll see later, Hitler was a master of stagecraft as well. Well, I've mentioned already, it was the ideas of Hegel that really underlie this. The various elements of Hegelian politics, not all are present here, but many of them are. this idea that everything is to be within the state, so everything is really political. The state is organic, it's really like an organism. The individual has value only in the context of the state. Liberty is really proper coordination with the state. All of this is something that he takes on board and thinks that Hegel has already given you an argument for. He rejects the last, interestingly. He does not think it's the case that no trade-offs have to be made. In fact, he thinks that life is, in some sense, tragic, and that it's the trade-offs that give life meaning. And so at a certain level, he says, look, don't think it's going to be easy. Don't think that there are just false choices that people offer you. No, there are real choices. And that's why conflict is inevitable. That's why strength is so important. Because there are real conflicts that are emerged. Real trade-offs will have to be made. You better be the one who's strong enough to control the terms of those trade-offs. So here are some of the ways in which that gets manifested in his thought. To know men, he says, one must know man. And to know man must be acquainted with reality and its laws. There can be no conception of the state which is not fundamentally a conception of life, an organic conception of the world. And that becomes vital in thinking about how to express things as well in terms of conflict. Let me just zip through here in our last moments to that idea of conflict. Yes, struggle is at the origin of all things. Life is full of contrasts. And so he says, struggle remains at the root of human nature. However, it's good that it's so. He says, what we must do is make ourselves strong. In fact, he said, a day without any fighting, a day without struggle will be a day of ruin, a day of ending. And so humanity really requires struggle. We find our meaning in it. And so conflict becomes really the highest expression of a people's character. Next time we will leave this and look at the Depression in the United States.